Evening, folks. Thanks for coming in. Hope you are well. Hi, Nicole and Gillian. Hope you are well and safe. So tonight we are doing. There's my echo back. We've got a slight echo tonight, folks. We can't find where it is. So I've been playing about with bits and pieces, trying to sort it, but I think it likes us too much because it's wanting to hang about. It's wanting to stay loose. So tonight we're doing our favourite British monarchs. Each member of the team is going to tell you about their particular favourite king or queen. And Laura, who's also another member of the team, she's on the panel tonight. So I'm going to be telling you about her choice. There's Laura there. Hi, Laura. Thanks for coming in. So to get started, the monarchy in Britain stretches way back to 827 with King Egbert. Hi, I was saying hi, Sam. Sam's there. Why Sam's name come up there? And we'll see we've lost Shelley. We're off to a good start, folks. Do apologise. Just bear with us. We will get it right. You know, we're new to this kind of live game, but we will get it right. So from 827, over the next centuries, there was various monarchs, all with reigns ranging from about 3 years to 10, 20 years. But the first favourite one is Sam. Sam?
No, it's not Shelley.
It's Shelley, who seems to have disappeared.
So we need to wait till Shelley comes back.
So, we're lost Robert the Bruce, but I'm sure Shelley will be back presently. So we're really off to a good start tonight. So if anybody new's in the room, we're not usually like this. We're usually kind of organised and stuff, you know. We're usually okay. We know what we're doing. There's Nicole and of course Queen Sarah and Scott. Sarah doesn't count in this, Nicole. You know, she's not an actual monarch. You know, she's just Sarah.
I'll take that down there now.
Gillian's here. And Laura's here. Laura, I hope you're feeling better, though. As the British is first share of monarchs.
Do you want to do some of these?
Stretching way back. I'll tell you some of them. The list is too long. We'd be here till next Thursday if I was to read some of them. So it started off 827 with King Egbert. He reigned for 12 years, and then, now I might pronounce this wrong, folks, so bear with me if I do. Athelwulf.
Yep.
He was from 839 to 858. He was followed by Athelbald. I don't know who made up these names, by the way. There were some very strange names back then. Hey, Ouija Freak, thanks for coming in, bud. And then we moved on to Athelred. I'm not making these up, by the way. These are actual names that they called, or who would call their kid Athelred or Athelbald, you know. And so that carried on to 871, where he had a normal name, Alfred the Great. From 899 to 924 was Edward. And then 924 to 939 was Athelstan. Yeah, I'm not making that up. Seriously, I'm not.
But these are just kings of England.
These are just the English kings. You see, the list is about 3 hours long. You know, there was a movie about Athelwulf.
Oh, there you go.
That all depends on if you're a royalist. I'm definitely not. Oh, there's Shelley back. Good stuff. We're saved. Shelley back.
Yay!
So sorry about that.
Yeah.
Did you
did you go?
phased out? I had a technical hitch.
I thought
Well,
you biffed it.
At least you're back. So,
Yep.
First king, 827, Egbert, and then you've heard some of the weird names that followed after it. So, Shelley's going to tell you about her favourite monarch, a good Scottish one, Robert the Bruce. Oh, you're Shelley.
Okay, right. So, hi everybody. So, we're going to be talking about Robert the Bruce. This one doesn't really last long, but we'll start with the beginning. Robert was born in Dumfries on the 11th, 1274. He was the daughter of Marjorie, the Countess of Carrick, and Robert de Bruce, the 6th Lord of Arundel. Now, both of them had claims to the throne, or links to the throne. His father's dad was one of the claimants to the Scottish throne during the Great Cause. Young Robert, he supported this cause and eventually took part in the revolt against Edward I with the infamous William Wallace. Because of this, he was made Guardian of Scotland alongside John Comyn, now Robert's chief rival for the throne. So you can imagine they didn't get on. Robert, he soon resigned because of his arguments with Comyn, but more so the restoration of John Balliol to the Scottish throne. He then submitted to Edward I in 1302. But afterwards, Robert inherited his father's claim to the Scottish throne upon his father's death. And then in 1306, Robert, he was excommunicated, outlawed by the Pope after he wounded Comyn. But he got Comyn to a church and he wounded him there by a blade. But as he left there, Robert's men had finished him off. He was quickly given absolution by the Bishop of Glasgow, which then allowed him to seize the throne, and finally then he was crowned King of Scots in March 1306. But sadly, he was defeated in the Battle of Methven by England. This must have just stirred on some amount of anger in him and determination. So he began a rampage against the English, waging war against his enemies. His confidence and armies grew until finally Bannockburn in 1314. The much larger English army was defeated under the rule of Edward II, which was after that he waged war against most of northern England. Then he went to Ireland, where they wanted them to stand up against the English, but the Irish were for none of it. But despite the fact that he had won against the English at Bannockburn, Edward II refused to renounce his claim to the overlordship of the Scotland, and in 1320, the Scottish nobility submitted a declaration of Arbroath to Pope John, declaring Robert as the rightful monarch and asserting Scotland's status as an independent kingdom. And so in 1324, the Pope recognised Robert I as king of an independent Scotland, and in 1326, he was renewed in the Treaty of Corbeil. So he had done quite a lot, but for me, he'd actually went back and forth and back and forth. He was quite sly in the way he worked. Like he tried to just go from one team to the other to try and get this result. He obviously wanted the independence for Scotland. That was his main goal, but the way he went about it wasn't always the best way. But he only lasted a couple of years because Robert died in June 1329. His body, it was buried in Dunfermline Abbey, while his heart was interred in Melrose Abbey and his internal organs embalmed and placed in Serres Chapel, Dumbarton. So, for all he went to all that hard work, he never really got the chance to enjoy or do much once he was King of Scotland. He'd lost his original wife, and the English had managed to capture her and all his family pretty much. And then he soon married again. But he was very, very famous. Probably one of the well-known kings of Scotland. But it was his journey to get to the throne that seemed to be more famous than what he actually did when he became king. And that is Robert the Bruce. And I think that's as much information as I could gather from reading up and researching on him. What do you think about that?
No, that was really good, Sheila. So basically, his life was more interesting before, he was crowned, basically, than it was after.
When you read about, I mean, I've been to the site of Barrackburn and I've been to his monument. And I mean, you do get that sense of pride and stuff like that. But I think it's more so how he managed to achieve to get to the throne. I mean, he already had the chance of being King of Scotland. But it seemed to me like he was trying to get there a lot quicker so that then he could gain Scottish independence because he supported William Wallace. Unfortunately, William Wallace got done for high treason and was hung, drawn and quartered in England. But Robert died peacefully after all that effort just to be king. But he managed to get independence.
He reached his goal. William Wallace, he was executed at Tyburn by Edward. Wallace is really fascinating, Cheryl. Well done. Gillian saying Robert Bruce Edward is buried in Ireland. I don't know that, Gillian. That's quite.
Yeah, I did. I did see that. There is a lot. I know he was in Ireland. His brother.
His heart is buried near my hometown. Who's it? That's Sam again.
You need to stop commenting. You're confusing this, man.
You stop commenting this because I'm reading your comments if you're watching. You know,
I am. I'm watching as well.
So that's Robert Bruce, a major Scottish hero as William Wallace. So moving on, it's now my turn, and I think everybody knows who I'm going to be talking about. To me, is probably the most famous monarch Britain's ever seen. I know a lot of people disagree with me, but as I say, this is just my opinion on him. Henry VIII. Henry VIII was the son of Henry VII, who was killed in battle. Henry VIII came to the throne he tried to claim King of Ireland. Gillian's talking about Robert the Bruce.
Must be.
So Henry VIII, son of Henry VII, who was killed in battle. Henry took over the throne. In June 1509, and it was the same year that he married Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was Henry's brother's, Arthur's wife. Unfortunately, his brother was killed, so Henry basically stated a claim to Catherine of Aragon. They were married for just over 20 years. They were actually married the same year as Henry was crowned. After Henry was crowned, he didn't waste much time in getting rid of the people he didn't like. Just 2 days after his coronation, the first executions took place of Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, who'd been friends with his father, but Henry never liked them, and he always wanted shot at them, basically. So Henry, as I say, didn't waste much time in having a spring clean after he was put on the throne. There was a dispute towards Henry's claim to the throne. Duke of Suffolk always claimed that Henry's father had stolen the title. So he tried to raise a coup against Henry early in his reign, and he relied on some of the members of the Privy Council. But they backstabbed him, they betrayed him, and to gain more favour from the king, they betrayed him to the king. So he was swiftly arrested and tried for treason against the king and executed. So that was another threat out of the way. Henry started off as a good king. He wanted to make, he wanted the best for his country. When his father died, he left him the equivalent of £275 million in our money, today's money. So you can imagine he was a very, very rich king, and he set about his sights about improving his kingdom, basically. So one of the biggest things back then was a male heir. Every king wanted a male heir. It was a major, major thing. And so their wives were expected to produce a boy. If they give him birth to a daughter, it was frowned upon. So Catherine of Aragon gave birth to, she fell pregnant, she gave birth to Mary. And Henry kind of distanced himself from Mary. She was sent off to live somewhere else. And so the years carried on, and Henry decided, he said, after about 2 years of marriage, Henry set his sights on Anne Boleyn, who was the daughter of George Boleyn. Now, Anne's sister, called Mary as well, had found favour in the king's bed prior to Anne coming to court. But Henry soon tired of her, and George Boleyn basically pimped out his daughters to the king. George Boleyn was very power hungry. He wanted, in the Privy Council, he wanted as much power as he could gather. Henry set his sights on Anne, but Anne was different from everybody else. Anne was very, very rigid in her views, and she stood her ground against Henry, and she told Henry, I will not, you won't bed me until you make me queen. And she was very strong about this. Henry was determined to get her, so Henry set about getting a divorce. And the only way to get a divorce was by putting the courts on mission. 2 seconds, folks. Excuse me, 2 seconds.
Sorry, folks. Wee Miami just popped in there. Scott will be back in a second.
Sorry about that, folks. So Henry set about trying to gain a divorce from Rome, and one of Henry's closest advisors at the time was Cardinal Wolsey. And Wolsey was a very educated man, but Wolsey was different from the rest of the Privy Council. The rest of the Privy Council were all noble blood, but Wolsey wasn't. He came from a normal kind of family background. But because of his education and because of his sharpness, it caught the king's eye. So Wolsey ended up becoming the second most powerful man in England, apart from the king. And this angered the Privy Council. So Henry gave Wolsey the task of getting a papal degree to divorce Catherine of Aragon, who was a very, very strong Catholic. For 2 years, Wolsey tried to get a divorce, and it wasn't happening. Henry was eventually getting tired of waiting. Wolsey saw that the king was getting tired, and at the risk of falling from grace from the king, Wolsey gifted Henry Hampton Court Palace that Wolsey had built for himself. He tried to gain more favour for the king by giving him it, and it failed. So eventually the Privy Council decided we need to get rid of Wolsey. So charges were trumped up for treason. The king stripped him of his titles, his land, his home, all his money. He was forced into poverty. Eventually he was arrested. Now there's 2 different stories about Wolsey's demise. One story is that he died of natural causes, and the other story is that he actually committed suicide while awaiting execution in the Tower of London. Either way, that was Wolsey out the way, gone. So to fill Henry, he was a Catholic, Gillian, that's correct, that's good. And that was the big issue with his divorce, because it was strictly against the Catholic religion. So as time went on, Henry decided that the only way he was going to get a divorce was to break away from the Catholic Church and form his own church. Hence was born the Church of England. Henry then took on Thomas Cromwell as an advisor, who was also an educated man. But after Henry broke away from the church, he managed to get a divorce. He married Anne Boleyn. Everything was fine, and Anne Boleyn gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. This angered Henry. Henry wasn't impressed. He was convinced he was having a son. As time went on, Henry decided to make up an oath to get the entire country to sign an allegiance to him, to turn against the Catholic faith and swear an allegiance to the Protestant faith. This caused quite a bit of uproar. It caused many wars, but the king was determined that this was the way it was going to go. He was that determined that his daughter Mary, who was a very, very strong Catholic, he actually threatened to have her on the scaffold if she did not sign this oath. One of his other closest friends, Moore, his name was Moore, he had grown up with Henry, he had been Henry's tutor. He refused to sign the oath, and he, what was that? He was eventually executed as well. This is how ruthless Henry became in getting this oath signed. Henry wanted power. He wanted to be the supreme head of the church, and it didn't matter. Anybody who stood in his way ended up on the scaffold. It's said that during his entire reign, he was responsible for the death of 72,000 people, the majority of which were executed. So, after Anne had gave birth to Elizabeth, Henry was still yearning for a male heir. Anne fell pregnant again. She had a miscarriage. That Rosalie, he sucked up to Henry. He was paranoid, Gillian. He was paranoid about losing favour with the king. But then you need to remember, back in these days, being in the king's court, the king's mind could change. The king's mind changed daily, and all Henry had to do was nod his head, and you would lose yours. So everybody in the entire court, from one day to another, did not know if they were going to see the next day. So everybody did their best to stay in the king's good books. But then Anne failed to deliver a son, and the Privy Council again were very much against Anne. He stole all the gold and destroyed the Catholic. He did with the dissolution of the monasteries, where he had every monastery shut down, stripped of his wealth to get into the Privy Council, because Henry, even though he was left all that money by his father, Henry is also known as the father of the Royal Navy. Henry increased the English Navy to the total of 50 ships. Henry spent money like water, basically, and the coffers were going thin, so Henry decided to shut all the monasteries and take every single bit of valuables in the monasteries. So as time went on, Anne Boleyn, yet again, failed to produce a son. Privy Council were getting fed up, and Anne had very, very strong political views, and the Privy Council felt threatened. We done a live on Anne some months ago, wasn't it? And so the Privy Council made up outrageous allegations of adultery. They said that Anne had had affairs with 6, 7 individual men, one being her own brother. They managed to convince Henry of Anne's guilt, and so all the people who were accused were arrested, they were tried, and they were executed. Anne was tried for treason, and she was sentenced to death as well. Because she was royalty, she had either the choice of being burned at the stake or beheaded, but Henry decided out of his mercy that beheading was the easiest way to go for her. And back then it was the axe that was used, but again, because she was royalty, Anne requested that a sword be used. So Henry dispatched for the services of the swordsman of Calais. Now, what came out later on after Anne's execution was that even before Anne's trial, the executioner for Calais was already on his way. So before she even went to court, she was doomed. They'd already made their mind up. She was for the off. So Anne was executed inside the walls of the Tower of London by a swordsman. So this left Henry without a bride. But they'd already set his sights on Jane Seymour. And Jane Seymour was cut from a totally different cloth. She came from a respectable family. She had an impeccable reputation. She was a good religious woman. And Henry and her ended up marrying. It's always been said that Jane Seymour was Henry's favourite wife. He was the wife that she loved the most because there was no scandal attached to her. She was totally pure. And she stood up to Henry with some of his political views and what he was planning to do. But she managed to produce a son, Edward. But unfortunately, Jane died in childbirth, which left Henry devastated. Henry went into mourning for months. Nobody's seen him, nothing. So yet again, the king was without a bride. So he got word of the Dutch princess, Anne of Cleves, who was said to be a raving beauty. And so he sent his artist Holbein over to bring back a portrait of her, which he did. And his advisor Cromwell advised him that the marriage would be good for relations and for Henry's own standing as king. Henry consented to the marriage before he'd even laid eyes on Anne. So Anne was brought over to England and brought before Henry, who was totally disappointed. Henry stormed out, saying that she had a face like a horse. So Cromwell knew he was in trouble. But the marriage went ahead, but the marriage was never consummated. Just after they were married, a young lady, 17-year-old called Catherine Howard, came to court as a lady in waiting. Henry again set his sights on Catherine Howard. So he decided to get an annulment from Anne of Cleves. But the difference with Anne of Cleves was that after the annulment, Anne of Cleves was well looked after. Henry gave her the sum of £2,000 a year. He gave her a house, lands. It was quite ironic because they became very, very close friends after the annulment. So Henry married Catherine Howard, who was only 16, 17 years old at the time. She became queen. But Catherine was quite flirtatious. She was a bit of a girl. And it wasn't long before she was having an affair with the king's groom called Thomas Culpeper. She was assisted in this by Lady Rochford, one of her ladies in waiting. A letter was leaked to the king telling him of the affair, and Catherine was promptly arrested. Lady Rochford was arrested, and so was Culpeper. Culpeper was executed more or less straight away. Lady Rochford was imprisoned. She went insane while staying in prison, and there was a law back then that insane people could not be executed. So Henry told Cromwell to tell Parliament to make it legal that for insane people to be executed. So Lady Rochford, she lost her head, as did Catherine Howard. But during this time, Henry's mood changed. Henry had a jousting accident where he received a severe head injury. He was also plagued by a huge boil on his leg from a previous jousting injury. And people at the time said this changed the king. Where before he was kind of laid back and loved life, he became very unpredictable. He would fly into rages at the slightest thing. He would execute people on a whim for nothing, basically. So he became a very dangerous man to be around, but, he was still the King of England. He then, after Catherine Howard met her end, he married a woman called Catherine Parr, who again was a very strong woman, noble upbringing. And unfortunately, this was to be Henry's last bride, because Henry then died on January 28th in 1547, therefore ending what was probably one of the longest and greatest reigns in British history. So after Henry, Edward automatically came to the throne. But unfortunately, Edward died in 1553 when he was only 15 years old. Before Henry's death, before Edward's death, Edward had made up a will decreeing that Lady Jane Grey was to become queen. Obviously, Mary Tudor and Elizabeth were still kicking about. So Lady Jane Grey was crowned. This enraged Mary Tudor, who later became known as Bloody Mary. And she had charges of treason, again brought against Lady Jane Grey. Lady Jane Grey only reigned for 9 days before she was arrested, locked up, and eventually executed, which left the throne open for Mary Tudor, a very, very strong Catholic. And don't forget, the majority of England by this time was under the Protestant religion. And so Mary set about trying to change that. And she was responsible, again, same as her father was, for the deaths of thousands of people, which earned her the nickname of Bloody Mary. Elizabeth was still in the wings. After Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth took over. And Elizabeth had quite an eventful reign, as in the fact that she never married. She was never known to have any lovers. But she was also a very strong ruler, very strict ruler. And she passed away in 1603. So that ended the Tudor era. You feel sorry for Mary. She was Gillian. She got a raw deal. You know, she was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII, but because she was a woman, because it was a girl, she was put away. And even, as I said previously about the oath, for her own father to threaten her with the scaffold if she didn't sign the oath, but she later backed down. He later, done a total turnaround on it. So Mary was, I think this fueled her rage as well when she eventually reached the throne, because I think she was of the mindset, because she was first born, regardless of sex, she was the true heir to the throne.
Mhm.
So that ended the Tudor era. Now, the next bit I'm going to do for you is for Laura. Also, Laura's not up in the panel. No, I said Elizabeth died in 1603.
All right, yeah.
Which ended the Tudor household, basically. So to say, the next one is for Laura, which I'm going to do because Laura's not feeling too well, so she's not on the panel. So the next one up is James V, and that actually leads into Sarah's one.
Yep.
So James V was a king. There was the son of King James IV of Scotland and Margaret Tudor, the daughter of Henry VII of England. James was born on the 10th of April, 1512, in Linlithgow Palace in Linlithgow. He was christened on the 11th of April, 1512, and received the titles of Duke of Rothesay, Prince of Grand Stewart of Scotland. James V became king at a very young age of 17 months after his father died at the Battle of Flodden Field, and was crowned at the Chapel Royal, Stirling Castle, on the 21st of September, 1513. But because James was so young when he became king, the country was ruled by regents, firstly by his mother until she remarried John Stuart II, of the Duke of Albany. James V's mother's life was all but private and complicated, but when Queen Margaret divorced her second husband, Archibald Douglas, the sixth Earl of Douglas, he kidnapped James. James was held captive by his now former stepfather for 2 years. During the time that James was held captive, he was showered with gifts by his former stepfather and introduced to unsuitable pleasures, which makes you wonder, it doesn't say what they were, but it just says unsuitable pleasures. So, yeah, I'm going to leave that one open and out there for people. So James managed to escape captivity in 1528, and one of the first things that James did when he rightfully became ruler after escaping was hound the Earl of Angus, his former stepfather, out of Scotland. By the year 1536, James V had already fathered 9 children illegitimately by numerous women and now felt ready to settle down. And so James V married Princess Madeleine of France. Tragically, Princess Madeleine had TB and died in the arms of her husband, James V, 7 weeks after arriving from France. He fathered 9 children. He was worse than Henry.
I know.
He was busier than Henry. So James V accumulated a massive wealth, and this wealth came from estates, profits of justice, customs, and federal rights. James was kind to his illegitimate sons, though, and spent a lot of his wealth in building work at Stirling Castle, Falkland Palace, Linlithgow Place, and Holyrood. In the year 1528, James remarried Mary Guise, a widow who had 2 sons already. After marrying James V, they had 2 sons together, but tragically both children died in infancy within hours of each other in 1541. And also in 1541, James's mother, Queen Margaret, died. And in the same year, war broke out at first Scotland was victorious, winning the Battle of Haddenrig in August 1542. So it was a busy year, quite a tragic year for him actually. So the 30th of October 1542, James and his army were at Lauder, and James had high hopes of invading England. His father was reluctant, and so James returned to Edinburgh. On the way, he wrote his wife a letter mentioning he had been ill for a few days. In November of 1542, James V's army suffered defeat during the Battle of Solway Moss. It was shortly after this battle that James V became ill. It was reported that he suffered a nervous collapse. Perhaps this was brought on by a defeat at Solway Moss. Historians do believe, however, it was brought on just by an ordinary fever. James V was in his deathbed in Falkland Palace when his only surviving legitimate child, a girl, was born, also known as Mary, Queen of Scots. James V died at midnight on the 15th of December in 1542 and was buried beside his first wife, Madeline, and his two sons at Holyrood Abbey. It's thought that the tomb was destroyed in the rough wooing in 1544. So that was James V, and this kind of ties into Sarah's favourite monarch. So I hope I made sense with all that, folks. I tried to cover all the wee bits and pieces as best I could, but obviously Henry VIII, James V, Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, there's lots more, and we'd be here all night. So I was trying to give you a brief summary of their reign.
So that brings us now on to my favourite monarch, which is all known as Mary Queen of Scots. So Mary Queen of Scots was born on the 8th of December in 1542. As Scott said, she was born a week before her father's death, which meant at just 6 days old, she became queen. She was originally meant to marry Henry VIII's son Edward, but due to the fact that Henry had broke away from the Catholic Church, the Scottish Parliament rejected this proposal. Henry VIII wasn't happy about this, so he decided to go to war with Scotland, which was called the Rough Wooing. Due to this, Scotland looked to France for safety and help. So Mary left her life in France at the very early age of 5 because her mother, Mary de Guise, who was the Dowager of Scotland, and her government agreed that Mary would marry the eldest king of France, which was Francis. This marriage would create a much-needed alliance, which would help neutralise the threat that England was proposing. So until Mary reached the age of marriage, she grew up and was educated in France, and her childhood was thought to have been the happiest time of her life. She was very, very intelligent. She had learned philosophy, poetry, drawing and needlework, along with many other subjects. She also learned how to speak various different languages, including Latin, Greek, Italian, Spanish, English and French. And her preferred language for the rest of her life was French even. During her early life at French court, she was very popular and extremely admired for the simple fact that she was polite and well behaved, and she was quite beautiful. So the marriage alliance, it was risky, but the benefits of the marriage proposal outweighed the negatives. The marriage made sure to a certain extent that Mary would be safe, and that the biggest thing was that her throne was also protected by the formidable Henry VIII. The marriage was controversial in Scotland because a lot of people not only understandably wished to see the country, but they also wanted her to marry into a Scottish noble family. And the simple fact that Mary was female put her reign at risk. because in order to have an heir, she would have to marry, and then her husband would then expect and be expected to take over the reins of the Scottish government. She's had quite a busy life so far, hasn't she?
She does really, you know, considering her young age and, you know, what she went through as a child and then to be, you know, taken to France and what have you. Think a child that age, in this day and age, has been uprooted and taken away to a foreign country and, you know, no parents, doesn't know anybody. It's all a big strange, you know, environment for her.
Yeah. So the negotiations started early in 1558 between France and Scotland, and they negotiated the terms of Mary and Francis's marriage. For a while, Mary would take the title of Dauphine of France, and also opened the question of what Francis would be to Scotland. It was deemed appropriate that it would be given the powers of the crown matrimonial by the Scottish government, which essentially made him king with the same authority as regent that Mary had. And then there was a matter of succession, particularly on the occasion of Mary's death. So Mary had signed a secret treaty that stated if she died before her husband without children, Scotland would be handed over to France. Secondly, Scotland's revenue would be the property of the French crown until it was reimbursed for the money it paid to help Scotland in its wars against England. And the last bit of this treaty was that she renounced any arrangement she might later make that would interfere with these terms. Included in this was the question of Mary's right to the English throne. And the wedding took place at the Cathedral of Notre Dame on Sunday, April 24th, in a ceremony and celebration that perfectly showcased the excess and drama of the French Renaissance. And just 7 months into the marriage, the secret treaty came to a head, at least internally, when Mary I died on November 17th at Westminster. And she was, like Scott said, she was swiftly succeeded by the 25-year-old Elizabeth Tudor, who was duly crowned and accepted by the majority of the English as the legitimate queen. But this was not the case in France, because Henry II immediately dictated that the coat of arms used by Francis and Mary should include those of England alongside France and Scotland. So he wasn't quite happy, was he? Because Francis thought that Mary was the true Catholic Queen of England.
Mm-hmm.
So needless to say, the move wasn't popular with Elizabeth. And then there was a matter of Spain, who had been closely allied to England thanks to the marriage of Mary I and Philip II. The marriage between Mary and Philip was over and childless. Philip then tried his hand with Elizabeth in the hopes of maintaining his threshold in the country, in England. But the move failed, so he then turned his attention instead to an alliance with France. On June the 23rd, 1559, Philip took his third wife, who was Henry VIII and Catherine's daughter Elizabeth, and Mary's close childhood friend. The marriage sidelined England for a triple alliance of France, Scotland and Spain, pretty much the worst case scenario. And the only saving grace as such was the untimely death of the King of France on July the 10th, 1559, due to a jousting accident. They all had a lot of jousting accidents back then, didn't they?
Because jousting was quite a popular pastime. It was also seen as a way to prove your strength and your manhood against other people. Same as hunting, hawking, archery, all that kind of stuff. Even though there were sports, there was all signs of manhood, especially jousting.
All right. So this then vaulted Francis and Mary, who at the time were only 15 and 16, to the French throne, but they were too young to rule. So instead, Catherine de Medici, did I say that right?
Mm-hmm.
Moved from a domestic and ceremonial role to Queen Consort Regent of France. So,
Gillian saying she was a true queen in reality.
of England.
Mhm.
She would have been the true Catholic queen anyway. So, whilst Catherine was on the French throne, skills truly took shape. She had the foresight to position herself as a moderate voice, which held its own risk in the face of the majority Catholic nobility and Spanish. Even so, it was thought that our negotiation talks began a long, drawn-out process that would continue well past the reign of Francis. So, initial policy was rooted in the belief that religious practice didn't require persecution and supported government officials who advocated for Christian reconciliation. Meanwhile, Protestant, how do you say that word?
Protestant.
Not Protestantism.
Protestantism.
Aye, was growing far away in Scotland, to putting considerable pressure on Mary de Guise's government. So France, at that point, was tied up in its own domestic needs and was unable to offer the troops to Scotland that Mary de Guise needed. Instead, they'd sent diplomats who effectively placed a bandage on an open wound. They didn't really help. And on June the 11th, 1560, Mary de Guise died, leaving the question of who would rule Scotland, with Mary being in France. And more to the point, it presented England another opportunity in the wake of the French and Scottish chaos to right the wrongs done by Mary's assumption of the title Queen of England and jeopardise France's power monopoly supported by Spain. England really did want the throne of Scotland, didn't they?
England were determined to get the throne. I think this is just my opinion, because after Anne Boleyn was executed, Elizabeth was named a bastard, and basically Henry kicked her out. So the upbringing that Elizabeth lost all her titles, so the upbringing that she had, I think that made her more determined to be a strong queen.
I think there was a jealousy as well with Elizabeth and Mary, because Mary was liked as well. So I think that led to a lot of the trouble between them as well. There was a lot of, obviously, like treason between each other.
There was a lot of it was a kind of tennis game, basically. It was going back and forth between them.
So the next bit is that Elizabeth wasn't a fighter. She was more of a diplomat, and this resulted in the Treaty of Edinburgh being signed on July the 6th. And this ensured, for the time being, that there was peace between Scotland and England. And this forced France to acknowledge Elizabeth as England's queen instead of Mary. Mary was unhappy at this decision, but at that point, she was too focused on the fact that her mum had just died, so there was not much that she could do about it. And by the autumn of that year, Francis had become extremely ill with an inner ear infection and died shortly after. His reign only lasting a brief 17 months. So they went through all that waiting time to get married and for Francis to become King of France from to only last 17 months.
Because an ear infection, well, again, don't forget, medicine back then was, it's nothing compared to where it was even 100 years later. So the simplest infection could grow and grow and kill you.
So France was then had King Charles, who was Francis's younger brother. But again, he was too young to rule, so Catherine de Medici stepped in yet again. Which meant for Mary, she was the Dowager Queen. She became the Dowager Queen even. She was in a powerless position. She was childless. So there was really no any reason for her to remain in France, even though it had been her home for the past 12 years, which is quite sad.
It is sad because you know, she's made that life, 12 years, a long time, she's made that life, and then she married somebody she loved who she lost, and then all of a sudden, bang, she's got nothing.
So at this point, she was now 18, and it was time for her to return to Scotland. And she always said that she was Catholic in belief, French in sentiment, and Scottish only by birth. So she left for her departure to come here, and she arrived at Leith just outside Edinburgh on August the 19th, 1561, to begin her reign that would make her infamous. And she arrived in Leith on August 19th, 1561, to begin a 7-year reign that again would make her infamous. After she returned to Scotland, she really was only queen for 7 years, which was quite short, before she was held prisoner and then executed. When Mary first returned to Scotland, she was greeted with mixed emotions, as she was a Catholic and Scottish, but Scotland had turned into a Protestant nation, thanks to John Knox. So for the next 4 years, she ruled Scotland on her own until it was time for her to marry again. And she had to marry in order to produce an heir to the throne, because that was the big thing back then.
Soon with Henry VIII, what have you, producing a male heir was a major, major deal. Back then, because it was seen, if you died, you know, without a son, without an heir, it was seen as being weak. And a lot of royalty took it, you know, like Henry VIII, he took it personally. He started blaming himself, but then he decided to blame his wife for the non, you know, until Edward came along.
So many important princes, nobles, and lords wanted to marry her, but she'd already met and immediately fell in love with husband number 2. In 1556, Mary married her first cousin, who was Henry Lord Darnley, and she quickly fell pregnant with her first and only child, James. Elizabeth saw this marriage as a way for Mary to strengthen her claim to the English throne, as Darnley had royal connections to the English throne. I think the connection was through through Henry VIII, wasn't it? Somewhere or another.
Mary's connection to Henry VIII was she was a cousin, or she was Elizabeth's cousin, and Elizabeth, let me get this, I might get this wrong, but she was Elizabeth's cousin, and she was the daughter of Henry the Seventh, and his wife.
But I was talking about Darnley.
After we talk about Mary.
No,
My bad, folks. Sorry.
I was talking about Darnley because he had a connection to the English throne as well, and he was Mary's first cousin, so there was obviously a connection somewhere. Back then, it was confusing. So anyway, it soon became clear that Darnley only married Mary to get to the throne, basically. He became king, but Mary kept all the real power to herself, as she refused point blank to sign the crown matrimonial. This meant that if Mary died before Darnley and childless, he would become king. The fact that Mary wouldn't sign the document infuriated Darnley, as well, you would think. So Mary's closest friend at that point was also an advisor, and it was a man called David Ritzel. As he was a friend and advisor, he spent a lot of time with Mary, and the rumours started to spread, as they would back then. And the rumour was that Ritzel was actually the secret father to Mary's unborn child. And Darnley was very jealous of their relationship and started to believe the rumours that were going about. So Darnley and his nobles planned to murder Rizzio. And during a supper party in March, when a heavily pregnant Mary was dining with her ladies and Rizzio, Darnley and his men stormed into the room and stabbed Rizzio to death. They stabbed him a total of 56 times, and the last blow was made by Darnley. So a heavily pregnant Mary had to witness this. Her husband, who's meant to love her, kill her best friend. So that must have been hard. And after the murder, obviously Mary had little trust left, if any, for Darnley. And 3 months after the death, their son was born. The birth of their son meant that the succession to the throne was more secure, but the marriage continued to struggle. And just 8 months after the birth of his son, Darnley was murdered, whilst he was away from the marital home recovering from a case of smallpox, or syphilis, as some reported. And whilst Mary attended the wedding of one of her closest servants, Darnley was left to defend for himself. And at around 2 a.m. there was 2 explosions that rocketed through the palace, and Darnley was later found outside in his nightgown dead. He was apparently smothered. There were no signs of strangulation or violence to the body. A post-mortem was conducted, but that came back as cause of death being internal injuries. The bloodstain is still in the room of Holyrood Palace. Wow.
Try and give me another point with John Knox.
John Knox was jealous and an evil preacher and never recognised a woman in charge. That is true. Because back then women weren't seen to be fit to be on the throne, basically.
He dragged Mary through the streets of Edinburgh.
Aye, that's right.
John Knox did. He drove her. He dragged her down through the streets of Edinburgh to the cross, and basically tried to ridicule her in front of the public to try and get the public to lose all faith in her.
He was an evil man.
He wasn't nice.
Talking about John Knox, he had claimed that the surgeons that done the post-mortem were lying, but there was no evidence of this or any reason that they would lie. Mary was suspected to be involved, and so was Lord Bothwell, one of Mary's closest advisors, but there was no solid evidence, and it still remains a mystery to this day who done it and actually what happened. So we're getting to the end of the story, eventually. She's got quite a long life. Not long after Darnley's death, Mary and Bothwell got married after he kidnapped her. This shocked a lot of Scottish people. Some believe that Mary was forced to marry him, which he kidnapped her, so it would suggest that it was a forced marriage. And the marriage would ultimately lead to the death of Mary Queen of Scots. Protestant nobles united against them, and eventually they met Mary and Bothwell's army at the Battle of Carberry Hill on 15th of June 1567. Mary surrendered on the condition that Bothwell was given safe passage to exile. As a last act of defiance, they kissed in plain view of the nobles, and Bothwell took off. Mary was captured and imprisoned on the Isle of Loch Leven, where she was forced to advocate, and her son went on to become King James V and King James VI of Scotland even. And she later went on to miscarry Bothwell's twins. But that's kind of, some historians say that she was pregnant and miscarried. Others say she was pregnant, she actually had the twins and then they escaped. And others say that she wasn't pregnant at all. So Bothwell was eventually captured and held prisoner in Denmark and died 10 years later. It's said that he eventually went insane. They'd actually put out a ransom for him, but no one in Scotland wanted to pay it. So Mary managed to escape, however, with the help of a servant girl. She dressed in old clothes and rags and managed to get a boat and escape. After she escaped, she managed to get a second army together to fight for her crown, only to be defeated at the Battle of Langside. In desperation, Mary fled to England and appealed to her cousin Elizabeth for help. She could have went to France, but she chose England for some bizarre reason.
I think that was the choice that cost her
Her life.
her life.
Her life.
And in the long run, even though it might have seemed the right thing, because I think she chose England because she'd already, because of what happened to her in France, and she probably thought there was nothing there for her. Whereas with Elizabeth, there was maybe a string of hope of getting some help.
Mm-hmm.
She still deemed Elizabeth as family, so she still held on that wee bit of hope that, well, actually, she might help me. She's blood. But obviously it wasn't to be.
But Mary's strong claim to the English throne made her too much of a threat, and many English Catholics considered her to be the legitimate sovereign of England. So again, the whole thing about her being the legitimate queen came back up, and Elizabeth was reluctant to have her killed. So instead, she imprisoned her for nearly 20 years. Can you imagine that being locked up for 20 years? That would just be, I don't know, horrible. And she was kept at a number of houses and castles all over the country. And Elizabeth treated Mary well at the start, but kept her distance and never met her. She had her own servants and physicians, and she was allowed to keep pets and have visitors at the start. But all Mary longed for was to be free and reunited with her son, who she'd obviously not seen in 20 years. And as a result of her numerous plots to obtain freedom, she was no longer allowed to communicate by letter, but she found a way to smuggle letters in and out using a beer barrel. Ingenious. She was still the focus of Catholic plots to put her on the throne, when correspondence directly linked Mary to the plots against Elizabeth, because Elizabeth at the time was getting a lot of death threats and stuff, wasn't she? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So she was tried and condemned of treason and sentenced to death. But the only evidence that they had on her was letters, which could have been forged. But however. And on the 8th of February, 1587 even, Mary Queen of Scots was beheaded. She was dressed in black with a white veil, and she carried a gold crucifix and writing book. She was led to the scaffold where prayers were read, and she then removed her dress to reveal a red petticoat. This was recognised as the colours of martyrdom. After 3 blows to the neck, she was dead. The executioner held up her head but dropped it, leaving him with her wig in his fingers, as her hair was very thin and frail. Her clothes and possessions were burned in the in the courtyard, so no relics remained. Her body was embalmed and incarcerated in a heavy lead coffin, which remained in the castle grounds until the 30th of July 1587, when it was moved at night for the fear of public protest to nearby Petersburg Cathedral, where she is today. And then her son, who Sam is just about to talk about, then went on to become king.
Thank you.
That was a long story. That was a shortened down version, believe it or not.
Two things. I don't think Elizabeth wanted to. Actually, I mean, she kept her for 20 years in prison. I don't think she wanted to kill her, but I think after she was kind of convicted or connected to a treason plot, I don't think Elizabeth had any choice but to sign her death warrant. But it is said that when Elizabeth signed her death warrant, she was actually tricked. She thought she was told she was signing some other document. Mm-hmm. But it was actually Mary's death warrant.
And the next king we're going to talk about could have obviously saved her because he was her son, but he chose not to. So that moves us on to Sam.
Hi everybody, I'm going to be talking about James VI of Scotland and 1st of England. James VI of Scotland and the 1st of England was King of Scotland from July the 24th, 1567, and King of England and Ireland as James I from the union of the Scottish and English crowns on March the 24th, 1603, until his death in 1625. James was born on June the 19th in 1566 in Edinburgh Castle to Mary Queen of Scots and Henry Stuart Lord Darnley. James was the only son of Mary and Darnley, and 8 months after James was born, his father died when his house was destroyed by an explosion. Mary abdicated the throne, and James, who was 1 year old, became King of Scotland on July the 24th, 1567. Mary left the kingdom and in 1568 and never saw her again. The young king was kept fairly isolated, and he received a good education until the age of 14. He studied Greek, French and Latin, which was rarely found in princes of that time. While growing up, James was surrounded by a small group of great Scottish lords, from who emerged the 4 successive regents, the Earls of Moray, Lennox, Mar and Morton. And for 9 generations, the Stuarts had been the ruling family in Scotland, and James all his life retained a feeling for the Scottish lords who gained his confidence. In 1584, he became head of the Presbyterian Church, which gave him the power to appoint the church bishops. James eventually married in 1589 to Anne, the daughter of Frederick II of Denmark, and went on to have many children. He was successful in his ruling of Scotland and was able to play off Protestant and Roman Catholic nobles against each other. James was heavily under the influence of the Duke of Lennox, a Roman Catholic, who was scheming to win back Scotland for the imprisoned Queen Mary, and James was kidnapped by William Ruthin in 1582 and was forced to denounce Lennox. The following year, James escaped from his captors and began to pursue his own policies as king. His aim was to establish his claim to succeed the childless Elizabeth I upon the throne of England. And in 1584, he became... Oh, no, sorry, 1 second. In his opening years of his reign as King of Great Britain, he established peace by speedily ending England's war with Spain in 1604. And the true test of his statesmanship lay in the handling of Parliament. The 2 countries had shared a monarch since the union of the crown in 1603, but England and Scotland were officially separate kingdoms until 1707. The Act took effect on May the 1st, 1707. On this day, the Scottish and English Parliament united to form the Parliament of Great Britain. Hence, the Acts are referred to as a union of the Parliaments. He died on the 27th of March, 1625, at Theobald's estate in Gough's Oak by having a stroke, and succeeded by his second son, Charles I.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Sam. So that's our favourite monarchs, folks. We hope we can have covered enough of their lives. Obviously, there's a lot more in their lives than would be here, as I say, till Thursday or something, covering absolutely everything, especially Mary Queen of Scots.
Well, the first time we tried to do her over 2 lives because her life was that big.
The thing is with James as well, that his main aim was to succeed Elizabeth, basically, because he believed rightfully as well that he should be king, but he didn't have the correct mindset or theory to equip him to solve like all the new problems that the English Parliament flung his way, and the qualities, mind and character just didn't work, and he couldn't understand like their Parliament or the temper of the English Parliament, and it caused a lot of conflict. And I think that's when a lot of the battles with all the lords and everything all came about, because they just couldn't see eye to eye.
Thanks, Frankie. She's amazing history of Mary. No, you're right, Sam. And back then it was all about religion and power, and if your face fitted, and all that. I think it was less about. I might be, that's just my opinion. It was less about politics, but more about power. Everybody wanted as much power as they could grab, and there was a lot of backstabbing went on, a lot of betrayal, as in Mary's case, with the letters about the treason and stuff, and Elizabeth being deceived into. Well, they say she was deceived into signing the death warrant. Whether that's actually true, we don't know. And then her son James, as you say, Sam, he wasn't really the mindset to to take the throne?
I think, to be fair, he was quite naive because he hadn't really been allowed to rule himself at the start because obviously he was as young. So he was only going by what all the other lords of the court and everything were telling him to do. And then when he was let off by himself, he's kind of like, well, what am I supposed to be doing here?
It must have been hard for him as well, not growing up with his mother.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, she did ask for countless meetings with him, and he wouldn't go. He kept turning her down.
Mm-hmm. But that could have been... See, obviously, it's way back in the day, so we don't really have all the information, but that could have been the fact that he was brought up with Protestant...
Aye, and she was Catholic.
She was Catholic, so they would have been bending his ear, kind of trying to persuade him.
He would have been brought up. Hi, Radio Prepper. Welcome. Hope you're doing well, buddy.
It's Chapel.
Is that you, Chapel?
Aye.
They changed his name.
Aye. They put further up that. Where is it? Hi guys, Chapel.
All right, so I didn't see that, buddy. Sorry. Hope you're doing well, Chapel. Long time no hear or see. I hope everything's Happy New Year. I know it's well and everything, but Happy New Year anyway. But I think he would have been brought up, in the Protestant religion, but his Sam says his mother was Catholic. And back then they never had, even going back to Henry's day as well, they never had a family unit. I mean, the kids were never near their parents. They always lived somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Or they had like a tutor sort of thing that kept them away in like the schoolroom and stuff, didn't they?
Nannies as well.
I was nannies, they brought the kids up, and occasionally the king would visit, his daughter or his son for like say 5 minutes. Basically, I hope you're doing okay. I love you, and I'll see you in another 6 months, kind of thing. And they were away again.
Aye, they weren't very family orientated at all.
No, it was more, whereas at the other end of the spectrum, the poorer people, they had kind of like family units. Apart from maybe the Boleyns, they had a family unit, but then as I says, George Boleyn, he was just a pimp for his daughters, basically.
Basically, he was just after the money.
Frankie P. Sam is saying you've got a nice house.
Thanks. No Wayne's. That's what that does.
No Wayne's keeps the house tidy. I mean,
That's her castle.
That's her castle.
That's my castle.
Well, there's a few good comments. I mean, good points about it all. But I mean, the British monarchy, as it says, goes back to 872 or something, whatever it is. And there's been that many kings and queens in Scotland, Ireland, Wales as well, obviously, that it's impossible to cover every single one. I mean, you could do a weekly spot, but, it would take months.
Nicole says, so we can expect a sequel.
I seen that comment. I was kind of ignoring that comment, Nicole. No offence, doll,
But there is, I sat and wrote them all down, and I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 pages just of the monarchs. Because obviously, at the start, England and Scotland were separate, so their own monarchs, and then Ireland and Wales get brought into it. And then obviously they reunited with James the Sixth. So
everybody wanted a piece of the pie. I think the main throne at the time was, even though I'm Scottish, but I think the main throne was English throne.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wanted English throne.
Even though they wanted their own throne, their own country, but I think the main goal was the English. I want the English throne, and they would do whatever. Nicole saying, same here. Our king Philip was raised by his uncle, King. I can't pronounce that word. Bod. I'm going to try and pronounce that name. Sorry, Nicole, because his parents loved the party life too much. So our king is a devoted, stiff Catholic.
But that was it. Back then, they did enjoy all the grander things in life, like the big parties and women and drink and food and.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was the case with Henry VIII. If you look at back in the museum, you can see his first coat of armor sort of seen in the chat earlier, to his last one where he put on a power of weight because of all the eating and drinking.
Oh, you can. I've been to London 2 or 3 times and I've seen the armour and the difference between the sort of 18-year-old Henry and the, I think he was 52 when he died, something like that. There's Sam's away as well.
And she'll be back.
We're on our own.
I know.
We're used to this. We're used to being left up here ourselves. Of course, I mean, but no, the difference in the suits of armour, I mean, I've heard as well, so I can't remember who told me, but somebody told me that the biggest one isn't actually Henry's suit. You notice Wales in all its history, they were not mentioned. Apologies for that, Frank. You know, nothing against. I love Wales. I've got friends in Wales as well.
Frankie, Wales is actually on the list between the first one that I've got. The first king of England and Wales is Edward I between 1272 and 1307. But like we said, there's so many of them that it would take us all year to cover them all because there's just that many.
So that's it for tonight, folks. Our next kind of live with this, we're going to do our favourite haunted locations.
Yep.
Where each of us is going to pick a location that we've been to, whatever, and write about it and any experiences we've had there. We're also starting this Saturday coming a games night. It was suggested, it's not our idea, so, you know, it was somebody else's idea, which we took on board. It's a really good idea. Because of what's going on, you know, with the current situation, everybody's stuck in. And the kind of morale and everything all over the world is very, very low. So we're going to start doing a games night, a weekly thing. Just no history involved, no paranormal. Just come in for a laugh, you know. That basically that's it.
A laugh and a chat. I mean, with the historical fiasco, we could always do
I think what Frankie means is between like Scotland and England, nobody kind of wanted Wales.
All right.
Is that what you mean, Frankie? Nobody was kind of after the Welsh crown.
But was that not because Wales and Ireland was pretty much included in the English?
See, Henry saw himself as the king of England, Wales, and France as well. Henry was well known to say, even though he wasn't the king of France, Henry deemed it as his royal birthright that he was actually the king of France as well. And this caused quite a bit of upset. This is one of the other reasons where he increased the navy to 50 ships, because he was always paranoid that the Spanish and the French invading England by sea. Well, actually, there was no other way to get there. Actually, come to think here, you could. That was the only way to get from England to France. England. That's what I thought you meant, Frankie. No, but when you think about it, there wasn't. The Scots wanted England, England wanted Scots, but nobody really wanted Ireland or Wales.
Because I think for 1209, and my list, I could be wrong, could be earlier, but from 1209, England, Ireland, and Wales were considered to have the same monarchy.
Mm-hmm. It was. I wish I'd lived back in Tudor times, but I'm glad in a way I didn't live back in Tudor times because it was just a mess. Basically, who's your king, who's your queen, who was going to die next. Basically,
I think the whole thing back then, though, because disabled folk,
the Welsh did not like the English and wanted nothing to do with the English.
Disabled folk and stuff back then as well. They wouldn't have stood. I wouldn't have stood a chance. I would have been.
Well, you see, back down that road, disabled people and that were seen as, that's where witchcraft started to come into it as well, because if you were disabled, you were seen as, in a way, that is you marked by the devil. Mm-hmm. And so the whole witchcraft kind of, and people, certain illnesses that, couldn't be explained, that was seen as witchcraft. So that started the whole witchcraft thing off. For instance, Pendle Hill,
which we will talk about in a different live.
We've got another live coming up. It's called Forgotten Pendle.
Yep.
But we'll say nothing about that now. So that's coming up as well. So that's it for tonight, folks. We hope you enjoyed your wee history lesson. Thanks to Sarah and Sam and Shelley. Shelley had to duck out, but she'll be back with us on Tuesday. We've got Ghost UK coming in to speak to. He's a very interesting guy. He's got his own channel as well. So that's us till Tuesday night at 9 o'clock. So enjoy the rest of your evening and stay safe, folks.
Bye.
Bye.